This is going to be a very technical review for the GPD Win 5. I've already done a quick look of the GPD Win 5, and a lot of my feelings are already pretty much the same. There are going to be a few things that I want to talk about at the end of this review, how I could recommend it. Largely, a lot of people are going to be asking, this is a very expensive device, and you could get a Steam Deck LCD for $320 with a 20% off. Is the Steam Deck LCD versus the GPD Win 5, is it 5 times better? In one particular instance, yes, it is. It can be 5 times better performance. Generally speaking, a lot of other games, we can get over 4 times the performance from the Steam Deck over to the GPD Win 5. So if you're looking at it from the Steam Deck OLED point of view, yeah, we can easily match that price performance gap on the GPD Win 5. And likewise for the other types of handhelds that are out there, it can get over 2 times better on those platforms as well. Before we get too far into the benchmarks are going to be very, very long. There's a whole section of this I think is going to be easily the biggest part of this particular review. Give a look in the chapter links below because it'll separate everything if you want to quickly jump around. I'm going to be doing 720p, 1080p. On the GPD Win 5, I do 1520, 2530, 3540, 40, and 50 watt. That entire range. And then I redid benches for the Asus RG Ally X, the MSI Claw AI8, and also the Steam Deck OLED. And those are all latest drivers, everything there. Like on SteamOS, I'm on SteamOS 3.8, and I rebenched everything. So everything is current as of today, all latest games that I did, all of them in sync, and it's going to give you a pretty good look at everything there. Before we get into the benchmarks, let's quickly go over some of the cool things that can be seen on the GPD 5 that I did not touch on already. The options in the BIOS allow us to push further power if we wanted to. Now, the particular unit that I have is only good for about 70 watt. GPD says they improved the heatsink and the fin design to actually have their TDP set to 85 watt. So the units that you're actually going to get are going to have those new heatsinks and be at an 85 watt limit. Other features that are in there are the ability to wholesale turn off specific cores if you want, or an entire CCD. Either or. I haven't tested this yet, but you can clearly just turn off any particular core you want. In the AMD overclocking section, we have the ability to do curve optimizer. So in these particular instances, we can actually put an undervolt on the CPU and GPU, and you can also do it at different temperatures. So if the machine's getting too hot, you can actually have a more stable type of undervolt. So it's not as an aggressive. And if it's very cool, you can make it more aggressive. So you actually have those abilities as well. There's a lot of cool features there. You can also do memory timings if you want. Just be careful when you touch memory timings that if you ever mess up anything, there is a little BIOS reset hole. So you can just clip that button and it'll reset everything to default. So you won't really super brick your device. You'll just be able to get it. Having said that, do be careful when you're in the BIOS in these advanced settings. A question that I had, and obviously other people had as well, is does this battery pack actually interfere with the thermal cooling of this device? Because obviously this battery is covering a large portion of the intake. We still have a little bit of holes here, and then there's the intake on the bottom. So does that really impact thermals? And the answer is kind of. I did a 30-minute stress test with and without the battery. And if you take a look at here, what you're going to see is that generally speaking, with the battery pack on, we're about a degree or two over with the versus the battery pack off. So it isn't like a gigantic difference. There is for sure a difference where the battery pack off, which allows it to obviously effectively cool it better, but not to any large degree. The only thing that I would say is that with the battery pack off, and I don't really have the best equipment for like testing differences in sound because of the ambient noise in my room as well, but it does sound like there is less turbulence, so it does sound like it's less loud. And ultimately, really, when you get down to this, it kind of doesn't matter because GPD includes software called Motion Assistant, and Motion Assistant has a utility in it where you can specify a fan curve directly on the GPD Win 5. And my particular fan curve that I like to use is 30 and 35% at up to 70 degrees Celsius. And then at 80 degrees Celsius, it goes to 80%. And inside of this fan curve, when you put the TDP at 32 watt, which is the best balance insofar as, satisfying the power that I get out of it and also achieving around 85 minutes of battery life, which is pretty much the same what the original Steam Deck LCD got. Gamers Nexus and I aligned on that data. You can actually go revisit the first reviews for the Steam Deck, and we both got 85 minutes as the worst case battery life. And that's basically what the GPD Win 5 does at 32 watt. And with that fan curve, you can't really hear the fan at all, even with the battery pack on. So I'm mostly fine with it, and I don't care, and it's the best of all worlds that I've found. Now, when it comes to, like, detecting sound noise, I don't really have, like, the best equipment ever. I do have one instance where I can deploy the best noise detection system ever. So here it is. And
Yeah?
can you hear it now?
No.
Jokes aside, if we actually just should take a look at a visual representation of what running the system at 32 watt for a length of time and have a 30% fan profile. Generally speaking, what's going to happen, you see that first bit that dips down, I actually had it at a very high wattage, and then I put in 32 watt. And you can see it go down to about 72 degrees Celsius, kind of hovers around there. But over time, it actually slowly picks up and goes around to about 76, 77 degrees Celsius and no further. Over time, it pretty much flatlines and stabilizes that at that 30% fan profile at 32 watt. We're cleanly under 80 degrees Celsius. This is totally fine for the chip. It is, for my ears, inaudible, for my wife, inaudible. And that is my personal recommendation for what you should run the device at. 32 watt with that fan profile that I showed you, that fan curve that I showed you, so that if it goes over 80 degrees Celsius, that it jumps the fans up and will cool down the device properly so you don't damage the device. But that's what I personally recommend. You get the best bang for the buck and also battery life. Speaking about battery life outside of doing 32 watt, what is the best case and worst case battery life on this device? So you will have to use motion assistant to push the TDP way down. If you put it to like 5 watt, the system will basically always use 7 watt, even if you push it way down low. But if you're running 2D games, this is still sufficient for playing a bunch of 2D games and getting very low power. Looking straight at this graph, you can see that a worst case scenario for battery life is 1 hour. So really not the best if you're going to be pushing this to its absolute limits by default where it runs from the factory. On the other side of it, if we were to force TDP to its absolute lowest, where it's if you put 5 watt TDP, it'll use around 7 watt TDP and around 10 watt total, a little bit under, around 9 watt. What you're going to find is that we're going to get a little bit over 8 hours, around 9 hours of battery life. And that's pretty much the range of battery life that you should anticipate for the GPD Win 5. Is as low as 1 hour or less if you even, try on hooking things and pushing power like crazy. Don't really recommend that in any regard. If you're going to be doing that, you should be only plugged in. And more to the point, if you're going to be on battery, I really wouldn't be pushing more than 35 watt more than anything. And we'll get into why that's the case. Even in the benchmarks, you're going to see that there's diminishing returns at the 45 watt area. Pushing the 40 watt is still worthwhile. But anyway, that's for you to decide. I'm just going to show you the objective numbers. So that's the look of battery life for the GPD Win 5. On the flip side, how fast can you charge the battery? So here's another visual representation of what's going on when you're charging the battery. So you can see that there's a clean line of power coming into the system, and we're slowly and surely, not only are we seeing the watt hour of the battery increasing, but we're seeing the charge percentage of the battery increasing. These look a little lined up, but as the video goes on, they're going to separate and diverge a bit as the battery charge goes to 100 and the watt hour goes to 80 because it's an 80 watt hour battery. And you can see that once we get to about 80%, 85%, that the power going into the battery pack at the 2 hour mark will start to flatline. And this is to prolong the battery life, not to put too much wear on the battery itself. So this is by design from the BMC itself. It takes 3.5 hours to like fully charge to get up to 100%. If you just wanted to get to 85%, you can get there in under 2 hours. Another thing to mention is when pushing this device to its max, like at 60 watt at an hour long, the device doesn't get hot at all. You can clearly see in this thermal capture that the AC adapter is hotter than the GPD Win 5, especially where you hold it. There is no thermal problem whatsoever insofar as you're holding it at length at super high wattages. So that will clearly bookend this on the opposite end of the battery characteristics. So we have battery life expectations, the entire range, basically as bad as 1 hour, all the way up to about 9 hours. And then we have how long it takes to charge the battery from 0 up to 85%. We'll get 2 hours, and then to 100% is basically like 3 hours. That's what it is right now. This may change based on the BMC if it gets changed or updated, but that's what I have recorded right now, and that's what I'm showing you. So we've gone over the BIOS, we've gone over the battery, we've gone over the fan, thermal stress test. all of those objective numbers are there. Let's go straight into the benchmark section of this. This is going to be very long. I would really advise using the chapter links below to kind of navigate around, but it's going to be a ton of data comparing the ROG Ally X, the MSI Claw AI8, and the Steam Deck OLED versus the GPD Win 5, and the GPD Win 5 all the way down to 15 watt, all the way up to 50 watt. So here's the benchmarks. All right, we have a ton of benchmarks to go through. So this is going to be kind of super packed. Make sure you pay attention to what I'm saying, because I'm going to give you context to understand where these fit insofar as total system power, because I'm going to show you 15 watt and 20 watt on the other platforms and why I'm doing that. For each one of these platforms, the Steam Deck OLED, I'm running SteamOS 3.8, the very latest. If we take a look at the ROG Ally X, that's going to be the latest 24H2, and likewise for the MSI Claw AI8, I'm actually on 25H2, which has the Xbox full screen experience. So I'm using latest drivers for every one of these, what we're looking at today, and I recaptured all the data. I will be taking a look at the Z2E and the Z2A, for the Xbox RG Ally and the Xbox RG Ally X, which is the HX370 platform. So you'll be able to get that information in about like 2 weeks. But that's just to give you an idea. I went through all updated benchmark sets for this particular data, so we have a good idea. We're going to be going through 15 all the way up to 50 watt for the GPD Win 5, and we'll be comparing them to the other platforms. But right now, let's just take a look at these particular slices. If we take a look at the bottom, we can see the Steam Deck OLED is 64 FPS effectively. And if we compare that to other platforms, the RG Ally X at 15 watt is about 6% better. No real particular, not exciting. The MSI Claw A8 at 15 watt is around 19% better. And for the GPD Win 5, it's around 28% better. RG Ally X at 20 watt is 29% better. And then the MSI Claw AI8 at 20 watt is 45% better than the Steam Deck. If we were to take a look at it from the GPD Win 5, only the ROG Ally X at 20 watt and the MSI Claw AI8 at 20 watt beats the GPD Win 5 at 15 watt. Now, however, we have to kind of understand here, because the MSI Claw AI8, when we look at package power, when I set it to 20 watt, it's actually including memory on package as well. So total system power is far less. In fact, the MSI Claw AI8 at 20 watt is actually very close to 15 watt on the GPD Win 5. They're basically 27, 28 watt. Only 28 watt on the MSI Claw AI8 and 27 watt on the 15 watt GPD Win 5. So keep that in mind when we're talking about this. Okay, so for all intents and purposes, the MSI Claw A8 being 13% better is a more apples to apples comparison insofar as what we're pulling from the battery and the types of battery life that you can expect, given they have the same types of batteries. So that's a great showing from the MSI Claw A8 in the 720p setting. Now, we're going to start pushing more power into the GPD Win 5. We're going to keep the MSI Claw A8 at 20 watt at the top. We're going to go through all the wattages, and then I'm going to include the Steam Deck and the RG Ally X at the finish. And then we're going to move over to 1080p for Batman Arkham Knight before we start looking at our other games. So let's take a look at that. All right, still 720p, but now we're pushing more power into the GPD Win 5. So I'm just going to use the MSI Claw A8, which was at the top before at 20 watt as our baseline, and just take a look at this, right? So at 20 watt for the GPD Win 5, we're now 117% better at, 17% better. At 25 watt, we're 38% better. At 30 watt, we're 57% better. At 35 watt, we're 67% better. And at 40 watt, we're 79% better. So just a real clear lead. We went from 93 FPS average to 166 FPS average. Let's take a look by pushing more power into the GPD Win 5 before start including the other stuff. All right, so now you can see at the tippy top, we have included 50 watt and 45 watt. And again, if we take a look at MSI Claw A8 as our baseline, we can see there we're 82% better and 86% better. So right here, you can see the diminishing returns start for the GPD Win 5. When we're starting to push these massive FPS increases, you're going to start getting some diminishing returns. We still have room in the hopper for GPU bound stuff, but again, you're going to start seeing diminishing returns around 50 watt, generally speaking, regardless of whatever you're going to do. So that's where you're going to start. The more power you're putting in, you're not going to be getting the dividends paid out of that. So let's take a look and see what the Steam Deck OLED and the Asus ROG Ally X, when we push all the power we can into those platforms. All right, and then at the bottom right over here, you can see that we have the Asus ROG Ally X at 25 watt and the Steam Deck OLED still at 15 watt. Now, I have the ROG Ally X at 25 watt, but we're only getting around like 2 FPS more. It's 2% more on averages. Putting 25% more power and getting 2% better gains, not really worth it, but I'm just including because I did the tests, and we can see that even the MSI Claw 8 is beating all of those. Anyway, If we take a look at the Steam Deck OLED and compare it to like the super high end 30 watt, 45 watt, and 50 watt. At 30 watt, the GPD Win 5 is 128% better than the Steam Deck OLED. At 45 watt, it's 166% better. And at 50 watt, it's 171% better. So almost 3 times better in these like super high frame rate areas, right? Because we're at 173 FPS average. Now, before we continue any further, I do want to show you that you see these 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile. Take a look at the 30 watt, right? Like if we take a look at 30 watt, sometimes in some games that I noticed for Strix Halo is that the default cap for the clock is 4 gigahertz, and the default power balance is balanced with an EPP of 90. And sometimes that arrangement is not great for games, and we kind of need to step in and change some of the EPP settings, or just change the CPU clock limit to get better performance out of the 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile. These are like default settings, so this is what it is. It's not the case for every game, but sometimes this does happen, and you kind of have to be mindful of it. Just making note of that as we have here. Let's move over to 1080p in Batman Arkham Knight. All right, now we're taking a look at 1080p, and this is going to be stressing the GPU far more. And you can see that Steam Deck OLED is not going to be able to keep up as well as it was able to in 720p, because Steam Deck really is a very good 720p machine. And I'd argue a lot of those machines are 720 machines, and the MSI Claw 8 does well enough on 1080p, but it really does need a bigger GPU as well. Anyway, inside of these scopes that we see right here, if we take a look at the Steam Deck OLED, ROG LAX at 15 watt is 17% better. The MSI Claw AI8 at 15 watt is 40% better. The GPD Win 5 is 50% better. LAX at 20 watt is 51% better. And the MSI Claw AI8 at 21 watt is 62% better than the Steam Deck OLED. Now, if we just have the GPD Win 5 as our baseline, the ROG LAX is 2% better, and the MSI Claw AI8 at 20 watt is 9% better. And this is where we're going to start seeing things, because that massive GPU block that's on there, even though the MSI Claw AI8 at 20 watt and the GPD Win 5 at 15 watt are effectively similar in total system power, the MSI Claw AI8 is starting to lose ground, and we're still better on the MSI Claw AI8, but not to the same degree as we were at 720p. Let's push more power into the GPD Win 5. All right, so we're going to once again use the MSI Claw 8 as our baseline. It's at 61 FPS, and at 40 watt, we're getting 126 FPS, so effectively more than double. But at 20 watt, 28% better on averages. At 25 watt, 55% better. 30 watt, 77% better. At 35 watt, 95% better. And at 40 watt, effectively 107% better. So over 2 times better on inside of these scopes. But we can still push a little bit more power into the GPD Win 5, so let's see what happens. All right, once again, we're taking a look at 45 watt and 50 watt all the way at the top. Now we're 119% better on averages at 45 watt and 129% better for the 50 watt. So clean over 2 times more powerful over the MSI Claw 8. Let's go ahead and take a look at the ROG LAX at 25 watt and the Steam Deck OLED at 15 watt and see where we stand. All right, so now that we have the Steam Deck OLED here and the Asus ROG LAX, let's compare them. For the Steam Deck OLED, the GPD Win 5 at 35 watt is 215% better, over 3 times better, 236% better for 40 watt, 254% better at 45 watt, and 270% better at 50 watt. Almost 4 times better. Almost 4 times better at 50 watt compared to the Steam Deck OLED. So, you have, when you're doing larger resolutions, this is effectively why the GPD Win 5 is the first 1080p handheld that we really have, because we're actually able to play games and further. You can go like 1440p, not 4K. Heavy upscaling. Anyway, we take a look at the ROG LAX at 25 watt. We're 100% better, 2 times better than the ROG LAX at 35 watt for the Win 5. 110% better on 40 watt, 122% better on 45 watt, and 132% better on 50 watt. So you're getting pretty good gains there from the GPD Win 5. Not as gigantic as they were for the Steam Deck OLED, because, pushing more power and having a slightly bigger GPU on the ROG LAX, especially with faster RAM, really helps us out. But you can see that just how much better the GPD Win 5 is. So next game we take a look at is Blackmyth Wukong, going from Unreal Engine 3 to Unreal Engine 5, which just murders a lot of systems lately. So let's take a look at that. All right, we're now looking at Blackmyth Wukong. This is 720p, low settings, however, no upscaling. You usually want to try to go at like 66% resolution scale. This is at 100% resolution scale, so it is 720p native. Steam Deck OLED, again, we're 720p native. The Steam Deck OLED's doing actually pretty okay here. Like it's kind of almost it's playable. So we're basically 30 FPS here, and likewise the RGB IX is actually a little worse than the Steam Deck OLED. But if we just use the Steam Deck OLED as our baseline, RGB IX at 15 watts basically the same. The MSI Claw A8 at 15 watt is 27% better. The GPD Win 5 at 15 watt is 32% better. The LIX at 20 watt is 34% better, and the MSI Claw A8 at 20 watt is 50% better than the Steam Deck OLED. If we use the GPD Win 5 as our baseline to see what's above that, we're effectively similar in terms of averages, but better on 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile, but 13% better on the MSI Claw A8 and 720p. So we have pretty much consistency between Unreal Engine 3 and Unreal Engine 5, where the MSI Claw A8 at total system power wise is having like a 13% gain inside of that 27 total system watt scope. Let's go ahead and push more power into the GPD Win 5. All right, so once again, using the MSI Claw A8 as the baseline at 20 watt. We're at 20 watt for the GPD Win 5. We are 25% better on averages. On 25 watt, we're 52% better than averages. That's a huge jump, like a sizable jump. Again, we don't get full fat bandwidth until 20 watt on the GPD Win 5. That's when we hit maximum clocks on the system. And then at 30 watt, we're at 72% better. At 35 watt, we're 87% better. And 40 watt, we finally clear that 2x, we're 113% better. So a bit over 2x over the MSI Claw A8 with using double the power. So pretty much linear, right? But I mean, obviously total system power, we're going to be chewing through it. But just from TP alone, even though packages included on the MSI Claw A8, even I guess when you scale it down because you want to get to a clean 2x, but we can still push more power into the GPD Win 5. So let's go and push more power into it. And now above, you can see at the tippy top, we have 50 watt and 45 watt. Again, using the MSI Claw A8 down here as our baseline. 45 watt is 136% better, and 50 watt is 143% better. Again, diminishing returns as we go there. But what's nice here is you can see that 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile has a nice, a far more consistent, clean line. We're not kind of dragging behind that average FPS. So far more clean results here. Just really, just very good performance at 107 FPS with, no upscaling whatsoever. This is 720p. Let's go ahead and take a look at what happens when we do 1080p with Blackmyth Wukong low settings in Unreal Engine 5 game. Okay, so now looking at 1080p, this brutalizes Steam Deck. It brutalizes the RGB IX at 15 watt as well. You can see that pretty much nothing here is very playable. The MSI Claw 8 kind of does okay at like 27 FPS average, but still with that 1 percentile being 23 FPS. It's like it's a no man's land of actually being playable at 1080p. So you would need to use upscaling of some sort, and then it looks like Wukong can look very muddy fast with the blur that they have in use. It's just going to 100% resolution scale is just so much better looking for Blackmyth Wukong, especially at higher resolutions. In any event, using the Steam Deck OLED as our baseline, effectively the RGB IX at 15 watt is 5% better, not all that much better. For 15 watt on the GPD Win 5, we're 38% better. The MSI Claw A8 at 15 watt is 39% better. So it's a great showing from the MSI Claw A8, to be honest. We're using less total system power and getting 40% better gains. At 20 watt, we're looking at 43% better on the RGB IX and 65% better than the Steam Deck OLED on the MSI Claw A8 at 20 watt. If we use the GPD Win 5 as our baseline, the MSI Claw A8 is basically the same at 15 watt, which is super impressive. But at 20 watt, we're like 20% better on the MSI Claw A8. Again, a great showing at 1080p. And for the RGB IX at 20 watt, we are at 4% better. So it is what it is. It's MSI Claw A8 is once again kind of at the top here. Still not playable. Like none of these settings are actually playable. So let's go ahead and push more power into the GPD Win 5. And here we can see pushing more power into it, it makes it far more playable. So once again, using the MSI Claw AI8 as our baseline, we're 13% better at 20 watt, 25 watt, huge gains, 63% better. 30 watt, we're 82% better. 35 watt, we're 93% better. Finally, at 40 watt, we crossed 2 times better, and we're 123% better at 40 watt. So pretty much really, when you get down to it, 35 watt is, playable. It's quite playable if you did some upscaling. I really don't recommend upscaling on Blackmyth Wukong. So at 40 watt, we're pretty much good. Like 40 watt, we can have it'll feel super solid to be playing Blackmyth Wukong. Let's push a little bit more power and see what happens. So again, at the top, you can see that 50 and 45 watt are at the top, but you can also see like how little like we're getting diminishing returns right here. So going from 45 watt to 50 watt, we're putting 10% more power into it and extracting 2% gains. Again, expect 45 watt is right at that layer, like 45 watt and 50 watt. That's where our diminishing returns mark is. So if we use the MSI Claw A8 as our baseline, for 45 watt, we're 144% better. And for 50 watt, we're 150% better, going from 27 FPS average to 67% average. Let's take a look with the RG Ally X at 25 watt and the Steam Deck OLED and see where they stand. All right, so Steam Deck OLED at 16 FPS average. At 35 watt on GPD Win 5, we're 218% better, over 3 times better. 270% better at 40 watt. Whoo! 300% better, 4 times better at 45 watt. 4 times! 4 times better. And then 311% on 50 watts. So, we're doing 4 times better than Steam Deck OLED, which is awesome. And then the RG Ally X, we are effectively 104%, so we're 2 times better at 35 watt, 136% better at 40 watt, 160% better, 159% better at 45 watt, and 163% better at 50 watt. So we're 2 times better and change over the RG Ally X. Next game we're going to take a look at is Cyberpunk 2077. So let's go ahead and bring it up. All right, Cyberpunk 2077. This is the Steam Deck preset at 720p. Again, no upscaling and no ray tracing. The only ray tracing game that we have in here is Doom: The Dark Ages, which we'll be touching on in 2 games from now. So let's go ahead. Look, here's something that's really cool. Just take a look at this. The Steam Deck OLED is actually beating out the Asus RG Ally X at 15 watt. This has to do with Valve doing work on Proton to just enhance Cyberpunk. They did it with God of War. They did it with Elden Ring. So there's Proton enhancements for those particular games that take it to the next level. It's actually super cool to see. So anyway, if we just take a look, it's 10% better than the RG Ally X on averages and 23% better on 1 percentile. Just goes to show you that the Steam Deck OLED can hit well above its weight class. If we keep the Steam Deck OLED as the first like baseline, the MSI Claw A8 at 15 watt is 20% better than the Steam Deck OLED. The GPD Win 5 is 22% better on averages. The RG Ally X at 20 watt is 33% better. And then the MSI Claw A8 at 20 watt is 39% better, 38% better. So that is what it looks like. If we use the GPD Win 5 as our as our baseline, the RG Ally X at 20 watt is 8% better, and the MSI Claw A8 is 12% better. It's always kind of doing that 12%, 13% in the 720p zone, which is cool. So let's go ahead and make the MSI Claw A8, which is the top runner right here, and push more power into the GPD Win 5. All right, now we've pushed more power into the GPD Win 5. So again, using the MSI Claw A8 at 20 watt as our baseline, when we compare the GPD Win 5 at 20 watt, we're 27% better. At 25 watt, we're 59% better. 30 watt, we're 80% better. 35 watt, we're close to 2 times better. We're 95% better. And at 40 watt, we clear that 2 times mark at 117% better. So a difference of 48 FPS average all the way up to 104 FPS average, pushing to 40 watt. But we got a little bit more power in the GPD Win 5, so let's push it. All right, now going to the 45 watt and 50 watt and the MSI Claw A8 at 20 watt. Compared to the GPD Win 5 at 45 watt is 135% better and 446% better. So a little bit 2.5 times better between those two. So great results for the GPD Win 5 at 720p Steam Deck preset. Crazy high FPS. So like the 720p, the 1080p 120 hertz VRR display will be able to make full use of this. Obviously, if you did upscaling, you'd be able to really get to enjoy the game a whole bunch. But let's go ahead and take a look at what. Oh wait, before we go to 1080p, I have to show you what the Steam Deck OLED and the RG Ally X at 25 watts. So let's take a look at that. Alrighty, and we can see on the bottom here, we have the Steam Deck OLED at 35 FPS on averages. The Steam Deck OLED at 15 watt compared to the GPD Win 5 at 35 watt is 168% better. Oh, we had 3 times better at 40 watt, right on the dot. Smack on the dot. 45 watt, we're 224% better, and at 50 watt, we're 238% better than the Steam Deck OLED. A difference between 35 FPS average all the way up to 120 FPS average. For the ROG Ally X, compared to just averages, the ROG Ally X at 25 watt, compared to the GPD Win 5 starting at 35 watt is 83% 82% better. At 40 watt, we are 2 times better, pretty much right on the dot. And at 45 watt, we're 120% better. And 50 watt, we're 130% better. So not quite 1.5 times, but pretty close. So really good results for the GP Win 5 and Cyberpunk 2077 at 720p. Let's take a look at 1080p settings. Okay, so this is what Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p, the Steam Deck preset, and no upscaling looks like. None of these are very playable at all. Pretty much only the MSI Claw AI8 at 20 watt is what I would consider playable. Maybe the ROG Ally X at 20 watt is kind of there as well. Not terrible, but kind of okay. I still wouldn't really like super recommend it. In any event, if we compare the Steam Deck OLED, Steam Deck OLED is still better than the ROG Ally X, even at 15 watts. Super impressive. So if we use the Steam Deck OLED as our baseline, the MSI Claw A8 at 15 watt is 22% better. The GP Win 5 at 15 watt is 31% better. The ROG Ally X at 20 watt is 38% better, and the MSI Claw A8 is 40% better than the Steam Deck OLED. I mean, that sounds like it's a good amount, right? Like, oh, it's 40% better. But when you're like, oh, the difference is 20 FPS and 30 FPS, that's like not playable to barely playable. So it's not super awesome, right? Like, even though the MSI Claw is getting good gains, it kind of doesn't matter. It's not getting it across any finish line that is exciting. Let's go ahead and push more power into the GP Win 5. All right, so we are now taking a look at Cyberpunk 2077 1080p, but we've pushed more power into the GP Win 5, and we're going to once again use the MSI Claw AI8 as our baseline. At 20 watt versus 20 watt on the GP Win 5, we're 29% better on averages. On 25 watt, where you look at that giant gain, it's like funny, as soon as we get full bandwidth and as soon as we start pushing more power, the GPU just goes absolutely nuts. 25 watt is like the sweet spot for like really extracting immediate gains. We're 64% better on averages, 2 times at 30 watt. We're right smack on the sub depth on 30 watt. At 35 watt, we're 118% better. And for 40 watt, we're 142% better. Let's push a little bit more power into that GPD Win 5 to see how far we can get it to. Alrighty, and over here we can see that the Steam Deck OLED and the ROG Ally X are in here. The Steam Deck OLED at 15 watt compared to 35 watt on the GPU 5 is 213% better, a little bit over 3 times performance. At 40 watt, we're 250% better. At 45 watt, we're 281% better. Boom, look at that, 50 watt, exactly 4 times better than the Steam Deck OLED. So we're going from 20 FPS to 80 FPS, so 4x increase in FPS. For the ROG Ally X at 25 watt compared to 35 watt on the GP Win 5, it is a 2x increase. Going to 40 watt is a 127% increase. At 45 watt, we have 2.5 times, it's 148% and 160% for 50 watt. And that's what the GPD Win 5 looks like for Cyberpunk 2077 1080p. So this is where you're able to get very playable settings, even at 40 watt and 35 watt. 35 watt is a good zone where we're going to be able to have like no fan noise, and you'll be able to get like 85 minutes of battery life. And, you know, you're effectively getting 60 FPS at full 1080p here with the Steam Deck preset, which is honestly quite nice. So let's go ahead and take a look at our next game, which will be Deus Ex Mankind Divided. All right, the next game we're going to take a look at is Deus Ex Mankind Divided. This is 720p with ultra settings and the DirectX 11 backend. There obviously is no upscaling because this was at the tail end of DirectX 11 stuff. So this is like the DirectX 11 hard games that existed. It runs its own engine and it looks beautiful today still. Like it's a really good game that looks excellent, especially with ultra settings, and it can be really demanding on the GPU. Also a very demanding DirectX 11 game. Give you kind of a good idea of like the types of what you can accomplish on the top end of DirectX 11. You can even see that the Steam Deck OLED actually outshines the ROG Ally X at 15 watt. The Steam Deck OLED is around 4% better on averages. If we just use the Steam Deck OLED as our baseline and go forward, the GPU Win 5 at 15 watt is again around 18% better on averages. The MSI Claw A8 at 15 watt is almost 30% better. The ROG Ally X at 20 watt is 39% better. And then the MSI Claw AI8 is almost 50% better, which is really good. So, I mean, you know, again, we're in a case where we're looking at the difference between 30 FPS and 45 FPS. So, you know, while that is a very good gain, it's not very exciting. For the GPU Win 5 as our baseline, the MSI Claw AI at 15 watt is 8% better. The RGLAX at 20 watt is 17% better. And then the MSI Claw A8 at 20 watt is 26% better. That's actually much better than the typical 13% that we get. I think we got somewhat close to like 26% on another game as well. The MSI Claw A8 is once again still just doing fantastic in the 720p area, also 1080p, but you could argue that it's still not transcendent, right? Let's go ahead and push more power into the GPD Win 5. Alrighty, we are now pushing more power into the GPD Win 5, again using the MSI Claw A8 as our baseline at 20 watt. At 20 watt on the GPD Win 5, we're 18% better. At 25 watt, we're 47% better. At 30 watt, we're 65% better. At 35 watt, we're 78% better. And we crossed 2x, we're 2 times better at 40 watt, effectively 114% better. Let's push it a little bit further and see what happens. And topping it off with 45 watt and 50 watt at the top, we are 130% better and 134% better comparatively for 45 watt and 50 watt. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Steam Deck OLED and the RG Ally X at 25 watt. All right, for the Steam Deck OLED as our baseline at 15 watt compared to the GPD Win 5 at 35 watt, we're 165% better at 35 watt, 220% better, so 3 times better, over 3 times better at 40 watt, 243% better at 45 watt, and 250% better, so 3.5 times better than the Steam Deck OLED at 15 watt at those wattages. For the RG Ally X at 25 watt compared to the GPD Win 5 at 35 watt, we're 80% better than the RG Ally X at 25 watt. At 40 watt, we're over 2 times better, about 118%, 133% for 45 watt, and 138% for 50 watt. So that is what Deus Ex Mankind Divided looks like at 720p compared to those platforms. Let's take a look at 1080p. Moving right along to Deus Ex Mankind Divided at 1080p with ultra settings and the DirectX 11 backend. Obviously no upscaling, didn't have it, but I'm just putting it there just so you know it's 1080p native. Now, this is very challenging for a lot of these handhelds. In fact, only the MSI Claw A8 at 20 watt gets this somewhere to even barely playable at its max power. So it's a barely capable 1080p machine in a lot of instances. But let's go ahead and start taking a look at it. Once again, we can see that the Steam Deck OLED pulling ahead of the RG Ally X at the same wattage. So kudos to the Steam Deck OLED. Using the Steam Deck OLED as the baseline, the GPD Win 5 at 15 watt is 24% better. The MSI Claw A8 at 15 watt is 32% better. The RG Ally X at 20 watt is 39% better. And the MSI Claw A8 at 20 watt is 55% better than the Steam Deck OLED. If we use the GPD Win 5 as our baseline, we'd see that the MSI Claw A8 at 15 watt is actually 6% better. The RG Ally X at 20 watt is 11% better. And the MSI Claw A8 at 20 watt is 25% better. So that's still a great look for the MSI Claw A8. But obviously, once again, let's push more power into the GPD Win 5. Alrighty, and putting a little bit more power into the GPD Win 5 using the MSI Claw A8 at 20 watt as our baseline. At 20 watt on the GPD Win 5, we're looking at a 25% increase. At 25 watt, that huge boost to 66%. Again, same type of thing that we see before. We're just pushing a little bit more power once we have that full bandwidth, that we really able to extract better gains out of that GPU. Going to 30 watt, we're almost at 2x, 97% better. At 35 watt, we crossed that 2x line. We're 113% better. And at 40 watt, we're 140% better. Adding the 45 watt and 50 watt up there, we can see that we can push it a little bit further. We're at 163% better and 72% better. Almost 3 times better than the MSI Claw A8 at 20 watt. So almost kind of linear with how much power we're putting into it insofar as package power. Obviously, the Lunar Lake is a lot more efficient just because it includes memory on package. But let's go ahead and add the RG Ally X and the Steam Deck OLED. Alrighty, the Steam Deck OLED at 1080p at 15 watt is effectively 19 FPS average. If we use that as our baseline, we're 3 times better at 35 watt. We're 232% better. We are 274% better at 40 watt. We crossed that 4x line at 45 watt, so we're 310% better and 325% better at 50 watt. This is a really good showing. We're just like really over 4x improvement over what the Steam Deck OLED can do. And for the RG Ally X at 25 watt, using that as a baseline on averages, 35 watt for the GPD Win 5 is 123% better on averages, 150% better averages on 40 watt. At 45 watt, we're at 175% better, and at 50 watt, we're at 185% better. Almost 3 times better. Almost, not quite there, but almost there, and that's what that looks like for Deus Ex: Mankind Divided. Next thing we're going to take a look at is Doom: The Dark Ages. All right, Doom: The Dark Ages. This is 720p, low settings, no upscaling, so 720p native. It also has ray tracing on all the time. And as a result, you can see that the GPU Win 5 is actually at the top. And take a look at the MSI Claw AI8, which is really has really bad 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile. So it's getting beat up a bit here. So if we take a look here, hey, Steam Deck OLED is above RGLAX at 15 watt. That's awesome. So Steam Deck OLED at 15 watt compared to the MSI Claw AI8, which is right there, is 17% better. So the MSI Claw AI8 is 17% better at 15 watt to 50 watt. For the ROG Ally X at 20 watt, we're 23% better than the Steam Deck OLED. The GPD Win 5 is 27% better on averages, and likewise the MSI Claw AI8 is. And this is the first time that we're really seeing that effectively the GPD Win 5, I would argue, is actually a better result when total system power for the MSI Claw AI8 and the GPD Win 5. So now that we have ray tracing included, all of a sudden having all of those CUs, because remember, for every CU there, CU on RDNA 5, there is a ray tracing shared core on there on every one of those CUs. So this is where we're getting those big benefits. Let's push more power into the GPU Win 5. Alrighty, now here we are. So again, using the MSI Claw AI8 at 20 watt compared to 20 watts on the GPU Win 5 just destroys it. It's 41% better on averages, 80% better at 25 watt, over 2 times at 30 watt, we're 112%, 125% for 35 watt, 150% for 40 watt. Let's push it up a little bit further. And now including 45 watt, we're 163% better and 173% better. We're closing in on that 3 times mark over what effectively is going to be at the top end of the MSI Claw AI8, because at 20 watt TDP, we're pretty much hitting max clocks on the GPU for the MSI Claw AI8, which is like 1.9 gigahertz. And you can push more power into it, but you're not really going to gain all that much more on the MSI Claw AI8. So this is what it looks like for Doom: The Dark Ages. You have very playable settings with no upscaling whatsoever at 720p. Let's take a look at, I was going to go to 1080p, but let's go ahead and take a look at what the Steam Deck OLED and the ROG Ally X is compared to the GPU Win 5 at its more top end. And there we have it. So again, Steam Deck OLED all the way on the bottom, we're getting 24 FPS, which is honestly arguably not terrible, like considering what it's up against. But compared to Steam Deck OLED 15 watt compared to 35 watt on the GPD Win 5, it's almost 3 times better. It's 186% better. We crossed 3 times better at 40 watt. We're 216% better. At 45 watt, we're 235% better, and 50 watt, we're 248% better. So almost 3.5 times better than the Steam Deck OLED at 15 watt compared to those wattages on the GPD Win 5. For the ROG Ally X at 25 watt, we are 2 times better at 35 watt on the GPD Win 5, 134% better on the 40 watt, we're basically 2.5 times better at 45 watt and a little bit over 2.5 times better at 50 watt. So that is what Doom: The Dark Ages looks like at 720p. Let's go ahead and bump it up to 1080p and really just fusticate these GPUs. All right, Doom: The Dark Ages, 1080p at the lower end of the spectrum. The MSI Claw AI8 is actually doing all right here. So again, once again, we have the Steam Deck OLED outperforming the ROG Ally X at 15 watt and 15 watt compared amongst themselves. If we use the Steam Deck OLED as our baseline, the ROG Ally X at 20 watt is around 19% better than the Steam Deck OLED. MSI Claw AI8 at 15 watt is 25% better. The GPD Win 5 at 15 watt is 27% better. And the MSI Claw AI8 at 20 watt is 54% better. And if we use the GPD Win 5 as our baseline, only the MSI Claw AI8 is actually doing pretty good here. We're 21% better than what the GPD Win 5 is doing, including 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile. So a better showing here for 1080p, albeit none of this is actually playable settings. 22 FPS at the top end of this isn't very playable, so that kind of doesn't matter for that. Let's go ahead and push more power into the GPD Win 5. Even a workout for the GPD Win 5 when we push more power into it. The MSI Claw AI8 at 20 watt. We're at 16% better 20 watt for the GPD Win 5. We're 57% better on 25 watt. Again, that huge gap as soon as we hit 25 watt. At 30 watt, we're 82% better. We finally hit 2 extra performance at 35 watt and 120%. And really, when we get down to it, at 40 watt, you know, you would even consider 35 watt to just be kind of okay settings in terms of playability. Like, you wouldn't really want to be using frame gen at 35 watts inside of these settings. So you're going to have to be doing upscaling and frame gen on the GPD Win 5 to get like a really clean, nice playable experience. But let's go ahead and push power a little bit further into the GPD Win 5. And now we're getting like 53, 54 FPS, 57 FPS averages at 45 and 50 watt. But again, you can see the pretty massive diminishing returns. 10% more power, only 6% gains. This is where you're going to start seeing it get lower. Obviously, if you push a little bit more power, maybe you get up to like 60 FPS. And then when you do frame gen, maybe you get like 90, 100. But you're going to be really pushing a lot of power into there. So if we use the MSI Claw as our baseline at 45 watt, we're 140% better and 2.5 times better at 50 watt compared to the MSI Claw AI 8 at 20 watt. Let's go ahead and look at the ROG Ally X and Steam Deck at these higher TDPs. And once again, with the Steam Deck OLED at 15 FPS on the bottom, we're over 3 times better at 35 watt, 3.5 times better at 40 watt, 268% better at 45 watt, and almost 4 times better at 50 watt. Or, the difference between 15 FPS to 60 FPS will be 4 times better. The ROG Ally X at 25 watt is 2.5 times better, 147%. Again, a little bit over 2.5% at 40 watt, so 165%. We're 187% at 45 watt, and we clear 3 times better the ROG Ally X at 25 watt versus 50 watts. So double the power, 3 times the performance over the ROG Ally X. Now that's just package power. We're doubling the power there. If we take a look at total system power, it's going to be over. There's an overage there as well. So don't just think it's just double. It's going to be over double the power, but we get 3 times the performance, which is really nice. I would still kind of like to be in 35 watt zone. So doing 1080p with some type of upscaling and frame gen would be ideal. But that's pretty much it. Let's go ahead and take a look at our next game. The next game we're looking at is Horizon Zero Dawn. This is 720p with the favorite performance preset and no upscaling. If we take a look here, this is actually a pretty interesting results, but this has happened before a lot. All the times whenever I take a look at Intel chipsets, AMD just fares a lot better on this particular game. So what we used to be where we have MSI Claw AI8 always at the time, it's now at the bottom. So the MSI Claw AI8 at 15 watt is getting around 38 FPS average. 20 watt, we're getting 45 FPS average. The ROG Ally X at 15 watt is beating it pretty handily. Even at 20 watt is about 20% better. The Steam Deck OLED is actually beating all of these at 15 watt, and just goes to show you like all the stuff that Proton's doing, AMD and everything else. It just takes really good, like 720p, fair performance, no upscaling, 60 FPS on Steam Deck OLED. That is solid. That is really, really good. And then you have the GPD Win 5 at 15 watt, which if we take a look at the Steam Deck OLED as our baseline is 6% better on averages. And then the ROG Ally X at 20 watt is 25% better than the Steam Deck OLED. All those being AMD platforms and still very good. So in this particular instance, I'm going to use the Asus ROG Ally X as our baseline because the MSI Claw A8 doesn't even really rank all that well. So let's go ahead and use that. All right, so now at our bottom line here for 720p favorite performance, the bottom performance is 75, 76 FPS average, goes all the way up to 145 FPS average at 40 watt for the GPD 5. So going through each one using the ROG Ally X at 20 watt as our baseline, we have 20% better performance, 21% better performance at 20 watt on the Win 5. At 25 watt, we're 42% better. At 30 watt, we're 56% better. At 35 watt, we're 70% better. And we're almost 2 times better at 40 watt. Let's push it a little bit further. Now at the tippity top over there, we can see that we have 50 watt and 40 watt that have been added. Again, using it as a baseline, we finally crossed 2x performance and 112% over what the Asus ROG Ally X can do at 20 watt. We'll just go ahead and add in the previous 2 models, which is the Claw and the Steam Deck OLED. All right. And the MSI Claw AI8 at 20 watt, again, the worst performing of the bunch. At 35 watt, the GPD Win 5 is 185% better. We're over 3 times better at 40 watt, almost 3.5 times better at 45 watt, and clearly 3.5 times better at 50 watt. So the difference between 45 FPS average and 160 FPS average. For the Steam Deck OLED at 15 watt compared to 35 watt on the Win 2, we're over 2 times better. At 40 watt, we're almost 2.5 times better. At 45 watt, we just climb over 2.5 times better. And at 50 watt, we're 165% better. So that's where Horizon Zero Dawn looks at 720p. take a look at 1080p, but also we're going to change the performance preset to ultimate instead of favorite performance. All right, here we are taking a look at Horizon Zero Dawn 1080p with the ultimate preset and no upscaling. So we're going to be challenging the GPU a whole bunch, the best that we possibly can. Steam Deck OLED is kind of in a really weird place. We have this really bad hiccup that happened here on 0.2 percentile. 15 watt on the RGLAX is on the bottom. The MSI Claw AA8 actually comes up a little bit. Somewhere in that ultimate setting preset is kind of favoring itself a little bit better in the middle ground. And then the GPD Win 5 is right at the top. But once again, we have the Asus RG LAX at 20 watt, kind of being at the top. Still not very playable at 1080p ultimate preset. You wouldn't really want to play like this specifically. It's not going to be the best playing experience. So again, let's push more power into the GPD Win 5. All right, to speed this part up along, we're going to skip some steps here and we'll just kind of combine a few things. So before we had the Asus RG LAX at 20 watt, and at the GPD Win 5 at 20 watt is 40% better. GPD Win 5 at 25 watt is 87% better. And then going all the way up to 50 watt is effectively 3 times better, 195% better. So we went from 27 FPS on the RGLAX all the way up to 81 FPS, 1080p ultimate preset, no upscaling, so just straight native. Compared to the Steam Deck OLED at 15 watt compared to the GPD Win 5 at 20 watt is 71% better. At 25 watt is over 2 times better. And then at 50 watt, we're 3.5 times better than Steam Deck OLED. And for the MSI Claw AI8, at 20 watt versus 20 watt on GPD Win 5 is 54% better. We're 2 times better at 25 watt and over 3 times better at 50 watt. So that is a look at the Horizon Zero Dawn at 1080p Ultimate. I just want to go and get to the last game here because this has been going on for so long. This is going to be Returnal. This is a game that brutalizes GPUs, so let's go ahead and get into it. And the last game we'll be taking a look at is Returnal at 720p, low settings, and no upscaling. So this is 720p native. Steam Deck OLED has gotten better as time has gone on. So we're at SteamOS 3.8, and the updates that they've done to Returnal, it's still not very playable at 15 watt, but it can be playable with frequent dips. If we use the Steam Deck OLED at 15 watt as our baseline, the ROG LAX at 15 watt is 16% better. The ROG LAX at 20 watt is 52% better. The MSI Claw AA8 at 15 watt is 60% better. And the GPD Win 5 at 15 watt is 65% better. And the MSI Claw AA at 20 watt is 90% better, almost 2 times better than the Steam Deck OLED. Let's push more power into the GPD Win 5. So this is actually interesting data. I'm going to show you what happens because I'm going to actually fix it up when we get to 45 watt and 50 watt by putting in 3 gigahertz, a 3 gigahertz clock limit on the CPU. So you can see our 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile looks like this. The end result, I don't know if you'll be able to see it in here, but our frame time is pretty bad at higher wattage at 35 watt, 40 watt, and 30 watt. So this is what we're going to be just looking at. I'll show you what it's fixed in a moment. The MSI Claw AI8 at 20 watt as our baseline. If we just do averages, we're 23% better 20 watt on the GPD Win 5 at 25 watt, 50% better, 66% better at 30 watt, 35 watt. We're 80% better, and we're 2 times better on averages. Let's get into fixing this up. So we're going to keep 35 and 40 watt in there so you can see it, but we'll put 45 watt and 50 watt in here so that we have a better comparison. All right, so up here you can actually see the gigantic difference between 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile. And this is me just putting in a 3 gigahertz cap and ensuring that the EVP setting is enforced on the system. So at 40 watt to 45 watt, we have a 55% gain on our 1 percentile, and 40 watt to 50 watt, we have a 70% gain. You can see that right here, we're getting kind of stunted on 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile. When I took a look at these benches, I rebenched them and kind of just tuned up the system a little bit just to make sure that we didn't have as many frame time spikes as we had previously. So that helps fix it up. But when we go look at the MSI Claw AI8 against 45 watt and 50 watt with the fixed settings, we can see that we're over 2 times better and almost 2.5 times better at 50 watt compared to the MSI Claw AI8. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Steam Deck OLED as well as the ROG LAX compared. Alrighty, so the Steam Deck OLED as our baseline, we go 4.5 times better at GPD Win at 50 watt. So Steam Deck OLED at 15 watt compared to 35 watt on GPD Win 5 is almost 3.5 times better. We're over 3.5 times better at 40 watt, So 330% over 4 times better at 45 watt and 4.5 times better at 50 watt over the Steam Deck OLED. So that's the difference between 26 FPS all the way up to 118 FPS. For the RG Ally X at 25 watt, our averages look like 2 times better at 35 watt, and we almost get up to 3 times better at 50 watt. Let's go ahead and take a look at 1080p. So here we're actually doing Returnal at 1080p with the Epic preset and no upscaling. The Epic preset doesn't enable any ray tracing, so it's just a more extreme version of it. And here we can see that, everything's getting pretty beat up, like 12 FPS on the Steam Deck OLED, obviously not playable at all. Likewise for pretty much everything here. Like nothing is, I would consider playable at all, but the MSI Claw A8 is doing pretty well here. So we're 37% better on the ROG Ally X at 15 watt, 60% better at 20 watt. The Win 5 at 15 watt is 74% better. The MSI Claw AI8 at 15 watt is almost 90% better, and we're over 2 times better for the MSI Claw AI8 at 20 watt. That's a great showing for the MSI Claw AI8, but it's really not like actually very playable overall. So it is what it is. Let's go ahead and push more power into the GPD Win 5. All right, and once again, you can kind of see that 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile thing that was happening. So we'll see what it looks like at 45 and 50 watt. But if we take a look, if we use the MSI Claw A8 as our baseline for averages, at 20 watt on the GPD Win 5, we're 10% better, 35% better at 25 watt, 58% better at 30 watt, 78% better at 35 watt, and almost 2 times better. We're getting 54 FPS average at 40 watt. Let's go and take a look at 45 and 50 watt. And here it is with 45 watt and 50 watt. And if we take a look at our 1 percentile, we're getting 18% better and 25% better. This is a game that looks like it does need a little bit more clean tuning up. One thing that I should actually look at for Returnal is taking a look at Bazite on the GPD Win 5. I think that's going to be pretty interesting to see how, if everything gets kind of fixed up versus here. It'll be interesting to look at. In any event, the MSI Claw A8 compared to 45 watt, we're over 2 times better and 133% better at 50 watt. Looking at the Steam Deck OLED versus the ROG Ally X. And it's not very fair, but here's a Steam Deck OLED at 12 FPS. If we use that as the baseline, we're over 5 times better on the GPD Win Max at 50 watt. At 35 watt, we're 4 times better. 40 watt, we're 4.5 times better. 45 watt, we're still 5 times better. It's a difference between 12 FPS all the way up to 60 FPS. For the ROG Ally X at 25 watt, we go all the way up to being almost 3 times better than the ROG Ally X. So I have some finishing thoughts on the benchmark section of this. There are things that I want to say as a negative for me on the GPD Win 5 so far on using it. So there's a few things that I want to make note of. Number one is something that does not bother me, but I actually let a coworker use this as well. And what I noticed was that he was using like the middle of his thumb to use the right analog stick. And what was happening was he was touching the screen as he was moving over left. And because he was touching the screen, it was like a mouse look. And he thought it was the system acting up. I use just the tips of my thumbs. I don't use the middle of my thumb. If you're the type of person that uses the middle of your thumb, I think that's going to be an issue. So that's not an issue for me. It's kind of like a weird thing, but I thought I would address it just in case that you're the type of person that does that. When it comes to the battery and how it attaches, I actually love the battery on this. I don't like when you hold it, the weight distribution of this does not feel like the 2 pounds that it is. I really enjoy it. And I think that the 80 watt hour battery on here is sufficient, especially at 32 watt, getting them that. I know it's only 85 minutes, but I'm still pretty happy with that overall because I was initially doing 25 watt, and at 25 watt, we got 2 hours of battery life. But the amount of power that you get from just going up to 32 watt is intoxicating, and extracting those performance gains it's so much fun. It really is a ton of fun. So I can't fault anyone for pushing more power because it is genuinely intoxicating and I love it. So that's a digression. I'm supposed to be speaking about the bad things. For the bad things for me, one of the things that I wish was the case, I wish that there was a way to set the fan profile at a hardware level, like in the BIOS. I would rather set a fan curve in hardware rather than needing to use the motion assistant software. I think that if it was a hardware level, it had a lot more layers to it. I'm not saying don't have guardrails. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that allow people to put the fan at 0% when it's 80 degrees Celsius. I'm not trying to say allow a customer to destroy their unit. Put guardrails in there so that at any particular degrees, like at 80 degrees or 85 degrees, make it so that the fan has to be at 90%. Make it so that the fan has to be at 100%. that's totally fine by me. I just think that at 70 degrees Celsius, 75 degrees Celsius, I would like to be a bit more aggressive with it. And I would rather do that at a hardware level rather than at a software level. But that is a personal preference that I wish was there. It's kind of a nitpick because we could still accomplish it. Obviously, I already showed you that the software that accomplishes the fan curve. So it works. I just wish that it was there. And the last thing that I would say, probably a nitpick as well, is that I wish that the right trigger was right here. It's just a little sharp, and how my finger catches it, it's almost like the amount of pressure that I have to actuate this trigger requires a lot of force, and I wish it was just sloped like an Xbox Series trigger was, insofar that it like kind of contours to your finger. Again, that's probably a nitpick, but that's the only two negatives that I could really feel with the Win 5 that I've had it for so long and been playing with it. That is pretty much it. Ultimately, can I recommend the GPD Win 5? I still think it's very much for enthusiasts only. It's a very expensive handheld. I think that the 385 is worthwhile. Still want a 385 and do benchmarks against it so that I can test and compare to see what we're able to achieve. I still want to be able to mess around in the BIOS. I still have to put Bazzite on this. There's still some other stuff I have to do, and I'm going to be making further videos on the GPD Win 5. Ultimately, what it comes down to is with regard to the price, can you achieve the price difference insofar as the performance difference? And the answer is yes, you can. You can achieve 2 times performance against the RGLAX or the MSI Claw 8, or you can do, 4 and 5 times the performance of the Steam Deck OLED. So yes, you can match the performance gains with the price increase gains, but it's still a very expensive handheld. So I can understand that people have hesitations for spending so much on a handheld. But the reality is that we're probably not going to get any handheld that has this type of performance for at least 2 years. So you're going to be waiting until 2027 until RDNA 5 starts hitting handhelds. So it's going to be quite a bit of a wait. And if you don't want to wait that long, obviously look at other reviews, but that's something you should look at. Now, if you don't want to but spend money there and you want to have some type of consolation prize, the MSI Claw AI8 that we had been showing in all the benchmarks is a nice middle ground. It's not super fantastic. I think if you get it, you're still going to find that you're wanting for performance. Pushing to 1080p still gets you in that 30 FPS zone. If you do upscaling and you do frame gen, you can kind of muck around and find some place that has a little bit more semblance. If you have the HX370, especially on Bazzite, you can make up for it. But the MSI Claw AI8 with Lunar Lake at $900 is a nice middle ground insofar as the performance that you get out of it, we're often like 50-60% better than the Steam Deck OLED. And price performance wise, especially with an 8-inch screen and 80-watt-hour battery, there's a lot of other niceties that come on the MSI Claw AI8 that it's kind of like a nice middle ground. Basically, that's what it comes down to. 100% I can recommend the GPD Win 5, but it's a ton of money. So don't just think that this is just some easy purchase for anybody. Times are rough right now, and I totally get that. Can I recommend it? Yes. It's not for everybody, though. It's definitely an enthusiast thing. So that's pretty much my technical review of the GPD Win 5. Thank you very much to my Patreon members as well as my YouTube channel members. Your support really means the world to me, guys. I hope this video was informative. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.